In a cave in the highlands of southern Ethiopia, a man was laid to rest facing the cave wall, roughly 4,500 years ago. He had no kingdom, no inscription, no monument. For most of recorded history, he was no one. And then, in 2015, scientists did something to his remains that had never successfully been done to any ancient African before. They read his entire genome, every letter of his genetic code. And what they found rewrote the story not just of one man, but of an entire continent. Because for 100 years, the world had been told a particular version of Africa's deep past. And this man, silent for 4.5 millennia, contradicted it. The question is not why his DNA survived when so much African evidence had not. The question is why no one had ever bothered to look, and what an entire field of science had quietly assumed about Africa long before this man was ever found. Here is the version most of us inherited. Africa is the cradle of humankind. Everyone on Earth descends from people who walked out of it. That part is true, and it is the part the textbooks love, because it gives Africa a starring role at the very beginning. And then, in the standard telling, the story leaves. It follows the migrants north into Europe and east into Asia, and Africa becomes a kind of starting line that the human story sprints away from. The cradle, the source, the place everyone came from. What that framing quietly does is turn Africa into a prologue, a first chapter, and then silence. As if, once humanity left, the continent simply held still, genetically frozen, historically inert, waiting. The deep genetic history of Africa itself was treated as a one-way export. Things flowed out. Nothing important flowed back. So, ask the obvious question. If Africa is where every human story begins, why was it the very last place on Earth to have an ancient genome read? Why had geneticists recovered DNA from frozen Siberians, from European hunter-gatherers, from Neanderthals in caves, but not from a single ancient African? Who decided that the continent that started the human story was the one least worth investigating? The gap was not random, and to understand it, you have to meet the man who finally closed it. His resting place was Mota Cave, in the Gamo highlands of southwestern Ethiopia. Cool, dry, elevated country, very different from the hot, humid lowlands that scientists had long assumed destroyed any chance of preserving ancient DNA. The researchers who studied him gave him a name in the local language, Bayira, firstborn. It was fitting because he became the first ancient African ever to have his genome fully read. He lived around 4,500 years ago. He was a man of the highlands, from a population closely tied to people still living in that region today, the Ari, among others. He was not a king or a conqueror. He was something rarer for the purposes of this investigation. An ordinary human being, untouched by certain events that had not yet happened in his lifetime. And that ordinariness, as we will see, is exactly what made him priceless. But here is the first thing that should stop you. For decades, the reason given for Africa's absence from ancient genetics was technical. The climate, scientists said, was simply too harsh. DNA degrades in heat and humidity, and Africa had plenty of both. The continent that gave the world its genome was supposedly the one place its own ancient genomes could not survive. It was a tidy explanation. It was also, it turned out, not the whole truth. Because the obstacle was not only the African climate, it was a decision, made far from Africa, about where the science was worth pointing in the first place. What changed was not the weather, what changed was a single bone and a single assumption. The breakthrough came from an unlikely place inside the human skull. Deep at the base of the head, protecting the inner ear, sits the petrous bone, the densest bone in the entire body. Around 2015, researchers had begun to realize that this small, rock-hard bone preserves DNA far better than teeth, far better than long bones, far better than anything else a skeleton offers. In the cool stillness of Mota Cave, inside Bayira's petrous bone, his genetic code had survived in a quantity and quality no one had managed to recover from ancient Africa before. Until now, this looks like a simple story of a lucky discovery. The right bone in the right cave. But it was not that simple, because long before anyone thought to drill into that bone, an idea had already taken hold in the most respected institutions in the world. an idea that decided in advance that Africa's past was not really a subject worth the effort. And that idea did not come from nowhere. It came in large part from one man standing at a lectern telling the world what was and was not history. His name was Trevor-Roper, and in the 1960s he was one of the most powerful historians alive. He held the Regius Professorship of Modern History at Oxford, a chair appointed by the Crown, about as much institutional authority as the discipline of history can grant a single person. When Trevor-Roper spoke about what counted as history, the academic world listened. And in 1965, in a lecture broadcast and published for a wide audience, he said it plainly. There was, he argued, no African history to speak of, only, in his phrase, the unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes. The African past, he told his audience, was essentially darkness, and darkness was not a subject for the historian. The only real history in Africa, in his framing, was the history of Europeans in Africa. It would be easy to make Trevor-Roper a cartoon villain. That would also miss the point, and this channel does not deal in cartoons. Trevor-Roper was not a fringe crank. He was the establishment. He was articulating, with the full prestige of Oxford behind him, an assumption that ran quietly through much of mid-century Western scholarship, that civilization, complexity, and change radiated from certain parts of the world, and that Africa was a passive backdrop rather than an active participant. He did not invent that idea. He gave it a podium, a crown-appointed title, and a memorable phrase. Now, understand the mechanism because this is the heart of the file. Trevor-Roper did not destroy any evidence. He shaped something more powerful. What questions were considered worth asking? What research was considered worth funding? What pasts were considered worth recovering? When the most authoritative voice in the field tells two generations of scholars and students that a continent has no history, you do not need a conspiracy to bury its past. You simply create a world where almost no one thinks to dig for it. The science of ancient DNA, when it finally arrived, pointed its instruments at Europe and Asia first, not only because of the climate, but because that was where the field had been taught the interesting questions lived. Africa waited. Who benefits when a whole continent is filed under darkness? And what happens when the darkness turns out to have been in the looking, not the land? But this is where the archive becomes dangerous, because Bayira's genome did not simply add a footnote to the human story. It contradicted the version an entire field had built. When the team compared this 4,500-year-old highland man's DNA to the DNA of people living in Africa today, they found something the frozen cradle model could not absorb. Modern populations across large parts of Africa carried genetic ancestry that Bayira did not. Specifically, they carried a signature of West Eurasian ancestry, genetic input that had flowed into Africa from the Near East. And by using Bayira as a baseline, the researchers could estimate when it arrived, a major back migration into Africa, roughly 3,000 years ago. Sit with what that means. Africa was not a one-way door. It was not the prologue that fell silent after humanity left. Long after the great exodus out of Africa, a large movement of people had flowed back in, reshaping the genetic landscape of the continent. The place the textbooks treated as the static starting line had a deep, dynamic, two-directional history of migration and contact. Exactly the kind of history Trevor-Roper had declared did not exist. The evidence had been sitting in living people's DNA the whole time. It took a dead man to make it visible. The case was reopened by a team of geneticists, among them Andrea Manica and Marcos Gallego Llorente at Cambridge, working with Ron Pinhasi, whose group had pioneered the Petrus bone method that made the whole thing possible. In 2015, they published Bayira's genome in the journal Science, and the headlines were enormous. The first ancient African genome, and evidence of a Eurasian backflow across the continent. And here is where the Black Archive has to be honest, because honesty is the entire brand. The first version of their claim went too far. They had reported that the back migration reached deep into West and Central Africa, touching populations far from Ethiopia. Other geneticists tried to reproduce that sweeping result and could not. The team investigated and found the cause: a technical error in the software used to compare Bayira's genome against modern reference data which had dropped a set of genetic markers and inflated how far the signal appeared to spread. In 2016, the authors issued a correction. Notice what that correction did and did not do. It trimmed the headline. The backflow had not blanketed the entire continent, but it did not erase the finding. The back migration into Eastern Africa was real, it was dated, and Bayira still anchored it. The system worked exactly as evidence-based science is supposed to. A claim was made, tested, found partly wrong, and corrected in the open. The continent-wide version died. The core truth survived. And this is the proof that cannot be waved away. Bayira lived around 4,500 years ago, which means he lived before the back migration that arrived roughly 3,000 years ago. He is a man from before the event. That is not a small detail, it is the entire key. Because to measure a migration, you need a fixed point from before it happened. A baseline of what the population looked like untouched. For ancient Africa, that baseline did not exist. There was no before sample. Bayira is the before. His genome is the fixed point that lets scientists prove, by direct comparison rather than guesswork, that something flowed into Africa after his death and changed it. Strip away the corrected overstatement, strip away the headlines, and one fact stands alone. A man buried in an Ethiopian cave, who never knew he was being saved for anything, became the anchor that demonstrated Africa's history moves in more than one direction. The proof is not an opinion about Africa. It is the genome of one African, with a date, a name, and a published record. A baseline that the old story of a frozen, historyless continent simply cannot survive. So, return to that cave and to the man facing the wall. We opened by asking why no one had ever read an ancient African genome until 2015. Now you know the answer was never really about the climate. It was about a story. The story that Africa was a beginning and nothing more. A darkness unworthy of the historian's attention. Bayira did not just fill a gap in a database. He exposed the assumption behind the gap. This changes how we are allowed to see an entire continent. Not as the silent prologue to everyone else's history, but as a place with its own deep, moving, two-directional past. A full participant in the human story, rather than its discarded first chapter. Trevor-Roper called it darkness. But the darkness was never in the land. It was in who refused to look. And a man dead 4,500 years finally forced the looking. Once you see the archive, you start noticing what was left out everywhere. Subscribe to the Black Archive, the evidence they left out.